I'm honored to be here. I should actually say honored to be back here because, as was pointed out, I was here a couple of years ago in an official capacity, and I am delighted to be back as a civilian. Let me say on that note, as we kick things off, since some of my past affiliations were mentioned, with Secretary Clinton, with whom I worked in the State Department for 4 years very closely, President Obama, with whom I worked also very closely for a couple of years in the White House. I'm currently with the Council on Foreign Relations. I will be speaking for none of the above, no particular administration or individual or organization, but for myself, though I suspect in the Q&A there will be a couple of questions about what some other people think about these issues as well. And hopefully some of those past associations will allow me to bring some insight on the issues that I know are really important to this community. And let me start with a word about NIAC, which I do know well and have been in touch with. And I want to just start by applauding your efforts to promote civic engagement among your members, among Iranian Americans, your efforts to promote people-to-people ties between the United States and the Iranian people, and your efforts to stand up for human rights in Iran, especially in an election season like this one, where we have seen such divisiveness and, frankly, even bigotry, including in some quarters a tendency to question the loyalties of certain Americans of different backgrounds. It is absolutely important to underscore that all Americans are equal and all Americans have the right to be heard. And I think NIAC plays an important role in that pillar of our democracy. You should also be proud of your work to promote exchanges and understanding between the people of the United States and the people of Iran. While our two governments have serious differences, and I will talk about those and I'm sure we'll discuss them, educational and scientific and cultural exchanges between our two peoples can help promote understanding and diminish the mutual suspicion that perpetuates differences, poisons diplomatic relations, and makes bilateral problems even harder to solve. And NIAC's support for these contexts, I think, is extremely valuable. Finally, let me applaud NIAC's work in holding the Iranian government accountable for its widespread violations of human rights, including in particular the unjustified detentions of numerous Iranian Americans. Now, happily, the Iranian Americans who were being held in Iran the last time I spoke to a NIAC convention, including Pastor Saeed Abedini, former U.S. Marine Amir Hekmati, and Washington Post reporter Jason Rezaian, fortunately, they are all now free. Sadly, however, Iran seems to have resumed the practice of detaining dual citizens from a number of Western countries, including the United States, including American citizens like Rabban Shahini, Siamak Namazi, and Siamak's 80-year-old father, Bakr Namazi. And Iran still hasn't provided meaningful cooperation efforts to find and bring home retired FBI agent Robert Levinson. Of course, the detentions without due process are only part of the violations of human rights that we see in Iran. According to the UN Human Rights Council, Iran once again executed more people last year, nearly 1,000, than any other country in the world. These included juveniles, and 47 of them were public executions. Again, according to the Human Rights Council, Iran continues to discriminate against Baha'i and other minority communities, restricts freedom of expression, and imposes severe restrictions on women's rights. Women are vastly underrepresented in the Iranian system, making up just 3% of the Majlis and 0% of the Guardian Council and Expediency Council. And I just again want to say that NIAC's past successful support for a special rapporteur on human rights, which didn't exist before and now does, thanks in part to your work, has been critical in drawing attention to all of these issues. And I think your amplification of calls to release the detainees is also critical in sending a message to Tehran that this is not just of interest to the United States government, but even to Iranian Americans who care about relations between the two peoples. Now, since I spoke here 2 years ago, there have been more broadly some positive developments in the U.S.-Iran relationship, but also some negative ones, and I'd like to say a word about both. The most positive step was, of course, the agreement to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in July 2015. I think the JCPOA made a very important contribution to U.S. national security by taking off the table for a very long time any significant risk of Iran developing a nuclear weapon. Once again, I want to applaud NIAC's work in supporting that agreement. Iran has since then dismantled some 2/3 of its installed centrifuges, gotten rid of 97% of its stockpile of low-enriched uranium, poured concrete into the core of the heavy water reactor that could have produced weapons-grade plutonium capable of making several bombs per year, and accepted the most intrusive inspections in its history, and also frozen research and development on advanced centrifuges. All of those, I think, are in the interests of peace around the world and the national security of the United States. So whereas prior to the deal, Iran was just months away from the capacity to accumulate enough enriched uranium for a bomb, now it's more than a year away from that threshold, will be for more than a decade, and will have these intrusive inspections and more comprehensive verification provisions forever. Repeated International Atomic Energy Agency reports have confirmed that Iran is upholding all its obligations under the accord, as is the United States. And so this agreement buys us a long period of time for Iran to prove its claims that its nuclear intentions are entirely peaceful, and potentially, and this is something I'll talk about, potentially to develop a better relationship with its neighbors and with the United States. Now, opponents of the deal continue to criticize it, noting that Iran's behavior has not somehow miraculously changed for the better. There are bills pending in the U.S. Congress designed to kill the deal, and one of the two main presidential candidates calls it a disastrous deal and claims he's going to somehow negotiate a better one. That he will tip you off to which candidate I was referring to. But make no mistake, walking away from the agreement in 2017 will not, I think, lead to a better deal, quote unquote, but it would isolate the United States from its international partners. It would allow Iran a convenient excuse to resume its enrichment, plutonium, and R&D programs and kick out weapons inspectors, and make it impossible to restore effective international sanctions. It's really hard to see how that would make the world and the United States a more safe place. And it's hard to argue that a better alternative would be a military strike that would set back Iran's program for a far shorter time than this deal, and probably leave Iran determined to seek to build an actual nuclear weapon. So I think the nuclear deal is a big positive, and we should continue to insist that it be fully implemented. If that was a positive step, however, there have also been negative developments, and we need to be honest about that. I've already talked about the continuation of some deplorable human rights practices in Iran. Beyond that, in the region, Iran continues to fuel conflict and sectarian tension, including through support for the Assad regime in Syria, which, as we speak, is literally bombing children and hospitals and aid workers in Aleppo, as well as other violent proxies in places like Iraq and Lebanon and Yemen and Bahrain, Palestine and elsewhere. Iran continues to test long-range ballistic missiles, whose only real use would be to carry nuclear weapons, contrary to UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which does raise concerns about Iran's long-term nuclear intentions. We continue to hear provocative, counterproductive rhetoric from the Supreme Leader, who not only spews ethnic hatred, but seems to question Iran's commitment to the nuclear deal. Now, obviously, Iran is not the only country, or is not solely responsible for all of the conflict taking place in the Middle East today. But it is also clear that unless and until Iran's behavior in the region changes, the Middle East will continue to burn, and prospects for a better U.S.-Iran relationship will be nil. Now, one of the big debates about the nuclear deal had to do with its potential to bring about change in Iran. And on that issue, I think the short-term critiques of Iran's behavior, however valid they may be, are kind of missing the point. It was never realistic to imagine, and neither I nor anyone else in the Obama administration imagined or argued that within a year of the nuclear deal, Iran would be transformed and cooperating with all of its neighbors and have an entirely different policy. Instead, we argued that the nuclear deal was just that. It was a narrow agreement focused on constraining Iran's potential nuclear weapons program through diplomatic means in the absence of better alternatives. And if it led for hoped-for changes in Iran's behavior, what President Obama called a different path of tolerance and peaceful resolution of conflict, those changes would take place gradually and only over the long term. And there are no guarantees, obviously, and the initial signs are not encouraging, but I think there is still some reason to believe that long-term change in Iran is possible and worth exploring. And let me just give you 3 reasons why, and then I'll conclude and we can sit down to discuss it, but I think it's worth thinking about because it's so important. First, I would point out that every time in the past 20 years or so when the Iranian public has had a chance to express itself, in particular through elections, however flawed and limited they might be, it has indicated a strong preference for more freedoms at home and greater integration in the world. This was true in 1997 with the vote for Mohammad Khatami, in 2009 with the Green Movement and the votes that it got, in 2013 with the election of President Rouhani, and again, to a limited degree in 2016 elections to the Majlis. Every time Iranians are given a chance to speak out, they seem to be calling for openness with the world and more freedom at home. And while it's difficult to clearly gauge Iranian preferences given the tightly controlled nature of the elections and the restrictions on polling, the evidence does suggest that the public, and particularly I think the next generation of Iranians, strongly favors change. Second, there's also a strong theoretical basis for believing that the opening of Iran's economy, as a result of lifting of sanctions after the nuclear deal, may contribute to long-term political change. Numerous scholars have pointed out that economic development, industrialization, and modernization help foster democratization, openness, and transparency. We've seen this in countries as diverse as South Korea, Chile, and Taiwan. Industrialization and economic growth leads to the expansion of the middle class, rising educational levels, demand for greater individual freedom and the rule of law, and increased international engagement. There's nothing automatic about this process, and obviously in Iran's case, we will need to be extremely vigilant to counter Iranian attempts to use sanctions relief to support terrorism or fuel intervention in the region. But we should also note that such intervention is not particularly expensive for Iran, witness Iranian meddling even at the height of sanctions, and that the alternative, total international isolation, could lead, like in the case of North Korea, to the worst of all, an Iran that is both hostile to the region and armed with nuclear weapons. Finally, the nuclear deal can help promote long-term change to the degree that it helps diminish the deep insecurity and resentment felt not just by the regime officials, but by much of the Iranian population. Now, while Americans and many of our friends in the region focus with good reason on Iran's threat to its neighbors, I don't need to tell this group that Iranians themselves have a long list of grievances and fears. These insecurities will not disappear overnight, whatever policies we pursue, but it's at least possible that with the passage of time, the emergence of a new generation of Iranian leaders and greater engagement between Iran's and its current adversaries could ultimately contribute to some sort of positive domestic change and a regional modus vivendi that would serve everybody's interests. So we don't know what Iran's going to look like in October 2030, when we'll be 15 years from the day the nuclear agreement was officially implemented, and 15 years is the horizon for many of the restrictions. We don't know what that Iran will look like, but we can be fairly certain that the current supreme leader will no longer be in power, and a new generation of Iranians, perhaps less marked by the conflicts of the past, will be in charge. That seems to be at least the possibility that such a new leadership will be open to what President Obama called that different path. In the meantime, of course, the United States and its allies will need to hedge against the very real possibility, or even probability, that Iran will not evolve in this direction. That means we will have to be vigilant enforce fully the nuclear deal, stand by our other friends in the region, and counter Iran's destabilizing activities. But while we do all that, we should also use the coming decade to explore prospects for a different Iran and an improved bilateral relationship that would allow us to escape from what now seems to be a permanent, costly, and destabilizing confrontation. A transformed Iran would have enormous strategic, political, and economic benefits, not just for the United States, but for all the countries in the Middle East. History, theory, and some evidence from Iran today suggest that such a development is at least possible. While hedging against the possibility that such an approach will fail, it seems to me reasonable to test the proposition. Thank you all very much for your attention, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Thank you so much, Phil. Can everyone hear me? The mic is on. Excellent. Thank you so much. I think particularly the second half of what you were talking about the possibilities for the future, is something that our membership is very interested in exploring and seeing what can be done now when it's proven that diplomacy, despite all the skeptics, whether in Tehran, whether here in Washington, or in Tel Aviv, or in Riyadh, that diplomacy could work. And not only could it work, if it could work with the most difficult conflict that existed between the United States and Iran, then there is great curiosity and desire to see why not use that same tool to resolve all of the remaining problems that you mentioned in the earlier part of your speech. My first question, mindful that you are a senior advisor to Hillary Clinton, is if you could just first let us know what was her role in the diplomacy that Obama initiated and led, but she was the Secretary of State. Because I think that is something that would be very valuable for us to know, that what was the role that she played in all of this?
As I think you do know, she played a critical role in bringing about the deal, or I should say first the conditions that made the deal possible. And today her position on the deal is quite clear as well. In terms of bringing it about, she saw early on that the path to avoid a binary choice between an Iranian nuclear weapon on one hand and military strikes against Iran was narrowing. I think anyone who has followed this knows that by the time Obama came into office and in those early years when she was Secretary of State, Iran was getting closer and closer. And I described it by the early Obama period, Iran was just a couple of months away from being able to develop enough enriched material for a bomb. And so the president had to make a choice with the Secretary of State, and they did gamble on diplomacy, that there could be an agreement that would block all of the paths to an Iranian nuclear weapon, avoid both the use of force and the Iranian nuclear weapon. But to get that done, the diplomacy had to be backed by pressure on Iran. And that's where Secretary Clinton's role was critical. You know, the United States has had sanctions on Iran basically since the revolution, bilateral sanctions. And they never brought Iran to the table or really slowed the nuclear development, because bilateral sanctions in the modern world, only get you so far. The sanctions were only going to be effective if we could get the European Union and Russia and South Korea and Japan and India and so on. And that's what Secretary Clinton did. And she made the case to the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese. She got Security Council resolutions, and she persuaded these countries that they had an interest as well in avoiding that choice. They didn't want to see Iran go nuclear, get a nuclear weapons capability. They also didn't want to see the United States or Israel use military force. So that was the case she made, and she got it. And I think a lot of people were surprised. There's even a Wall Street Journal article that admits its surprise that Hillary Clinton, who they don't always say nice things about, pulled this off and got tough UN Security Council resolutions. So her role in bringing that about was absolutely critical. And lo and behold, once those national sanctions became global and international sanctions, Iran really started to feel the pressure, had an incentive to come to the table. And when it came to the table, sure, it negotiated really hard. But the conditions were in place to leave it to know that it would have to make some very painful concessions. Thus, everything I described about the agreement in getting rid of the stockpile and the some 20,000 centrifuges that were spinning in the Iraq heavy water reactor. All of that was a result of the sanctions that she put in place.
But that's diplomacy to generate pressure. What about diplomacy to actually get a real dialogue going? What was her role in that?
Well, I described that pressure because that was, in fact, most of the first term. As you know, some initial contacts had been made that she sent her most trusted advisors to participate in with Iran to explore, and I'm talking about the talks in Oman, to explore whether it was possible to test Iranian seriousness and see if it was going to be possible to use diplomacy to resolve this problem. And in secret, because it was worth finding out whether it was possible before going public with it, she had two of her most trusted advisors, Deputy Secretary Bill Burns and her policy advisor Jake Sullivan, begin these meetings with Iranians to explore, could there be some deal whereby Iran would give verifiable assurances it wasn't moving towards a nuclear weapons capability in exchange for sanctions lifting. And so she not only signed off on that, but pursued it, right up until the end. And then obviously the rest of this came after she was no longer Secretary of State, when it moved to the P5+1 and the talks started taking place in a formal way. And so obviously she didn't conduct those negotiations, but she was at the beginning of putting in place both the necessary pressure to get the deal done, but also the beginnings of diplomatic contacts to make it happen.
One of the things I know has been quite important for people in our community, and I think elsewhere as well, is to see what her commitment is, not just to the deal itself, but to future diplomacy. You were there when the Obama administration first created the atmosphere that could make diplomacy possible. The president changed the language that the United States was using when speaking about Iran. He no longer took every opportunity to emphasize that the military option is on the table. Because it is on the table, you don't need to mention it, but the more you mention it, the more difficult it was to actually get diplomacy going. And he even said these things during the 2008 campaign, in which he's in the middle of an election. To be frank, that's not the language that we've heard her use as of late. There's been instances in which she said that she was proud to make Iranians her enemy, etc. And I think what that has been interpreted as is that the type of diplomacy, the type of statecraft that is needed in order to get diplomacy to work is not just sanctions, it's a whole set of other things. How inclined is she to go down that path, particularly now that the most important aspect has been resolved? And not to say that those other issues are difficult, are easy, but they should be possible to be resolved as well if we could resolve the nuclear issue.
Yeah. Look, on that, I guess I would just underscore that it's a two-way street. And you're reminding people of what Obama came in doing and saying is relevant here. Because he did, the whole thing about the clenched fist and an outstretched hand. I think he was trying to send a signal to Iran, and I alluded to this in my own remarks about the possibility long-term, diminishing that insecurity and fears, some of which is legitimate, right? It's a tough neighborhood, and it's in our interest that people can overcome these insecurities. And I think the president really tried that, but there hasn't been the response that would lead many to believe that that's going to be promising. Thus, if you hear her position on the nuclear deal and outreach to Iran in general, first of all, just to be clear, she very much supports the nuclear deal, even though she didn't negotiate it. She's been very clear publicly. She says distrust but verify, which makes good sense because we have to be very distrustful. There's been a lot of secret nuclear developments in Iran, and that's why the verification provisions are so important. But if it's verified, implement it, back it, and it's good. And once again, she was behind these initial contacts with Iran. And think how far we've come in that sense. When Deputy Secretary Burns, actually first when he was Undersecretary, was in the same room as an Iranian, it was a big, they had a very small conversation. It was front page news, U.S. talks to Iran. We're now well beyond that, and there have been countless meetings, and Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Zarif are in close touch, and it has not been just about the nuclear deal, but regional developments as well. But I do have to come back to, and again, I highlighted this in my remarks, while the nuclear deal is a positive, the advances that lead to any hope that there can be more fruitful diplomatic cooperation in general have not really been there. And thus, I mentioned Iran's continued support for the Assad regime in Syria, including its horrific bombing campaign that it continues against civilians, for Hezbollah as it stockpiles missiles, Yemen, some of the popular mobilization forces in Iraq, some of the language coming out of Tehran. None of that has exactly been constructive in letting us move from an initial nuclear deal to more broad cooperation. I think we all hope that becomes possible, but we need to see some signals that the investment that President Obama made is paying off, and only in those circumstances, I think, are you going to see broader support from the United States.
There's a lot of things that distinguish the two candidates right now, obviously. One thing that is quite clear is that she has been on the record from early on. She's backing this deal. She supported the deal. She said it at a time in which it wasn't clear whether the administration would win this battle in Congress or not. And on the other side, Trump is actually the moderate, because some of them would say that they would just rip the deal apart entirely, and he's talking about renegotiating it, which is a bit of a nuance of difference in between. But one thing that is really critical here is that the main challenges to the deal right now appears to be not what is coming out of Iran when it comes to their implementation of their end of the bargain, but rather that the sanctions relief has faced some challenges, and that till this day, about 30 pieces of legislation have been introduced in Congress that would challenge and potentially kill the deal. Now, those pieces of legislation don't have much of a chance of advancing right now for a very simple reason. The president has absolutely no hesitation to issue a veto against those pieces of legislation, and currently there's not enough votes in Congress to override his veto. Hillary Clinton, if she becomes president, may end up having a Republican Senate and a Republican House. That would mean that she very quickly would be faced with new pieces of legislation, new sanctions, that if not directly violating the deal, would be a slippery slope towards violating the deal. Now, no president would like to issue a veto in the first 3 months or 9 months or 12 months of his or her presidency. But the commitment to keeping up the deal and keeping it in place is going to require that. Could you tell us now where Hillary's thinking is on this? And is she ready to issue a veto in order to defend this deal?
So yeah, let me walk you through all that. First, just a word on the Trump position, because you glossed over it, and possibly rightly, because it's inconsistent and unclear, but it is worth thinking about the Trump scenario, because you're right, he says he would negotiate a better deal. Like on many things, he says he would just negotiate a better deal, but I do think that merits scrutiny. Does anybody really think, he's called it disastrous, and he sums it up to the extent he can even describe it by saying, they get everything and we get nothing. That's obviously an absurdity. We get nothing. I've described the really important things we get. And it's legitimate to be for or against the deal and be specific about what is it you object to, but just to say they get everything and we get nothing is absurd. It is also absurd, in my view, to imagine that if we, in January 2017, say, that deal is terrible, I'm tearing it up, I'm negotiating a better one. The idea that the Iranians would then come to the table and say, okay, fair enough, we'll give you, a better, why don't you, we'll get rid of the rest, the 300 kilograms that we kept, and we'll extend it for 50 years instead of 15 on certain, that's just unrealistic, frankly, which is why that deal didn't happen in the first place. And then very quickly, unless you believe that that somehow happens, that Iran doesn't have any politics either and the Supreme Leader just decides to give in across the board, then we're very quickly in that previous world where the deal's done. We don't have those international sanctions because we've just walked away from the Security Council, all of our partners, all of these countries I described that help us get the deal, the South Koreans, the Chinese, and all that. So we don't even get sanctions put back on place. Iran starts rebuilding the heavy water reactor, respinning the centrifuges, doing unlimited R&D, not allowing the inspectors. Okay, Mr. President, what then? And then, fine, if you want to say, well, then we use force, then we can talk that through. But just the idea of asking the American public to believe that we can just tear this up and negotiate a better one is, on the face of it, completely implausible. Secretary Clinton, on the other hand, has said very clearly that she supports the deal, and that means all aspects of the deal, nothing more, nothing less. And that means that Iran has to verifiably abide by everything it is committed to abide by, and that we too have to uphold our side of the bargain, which means that we don't impose nuclear sanctions through a back door. And that's kind of what you're referring to with some of these bills. And the reason President Obama has said he would veto them is that they are designed, he believes, to kill the deal rather than to do what they may be ostensibly designed to do. So we have always said, the Obama administration and Secretary Clinton, that other aspects of Iranian policy will be subject to sanction as appropriate. Support for terrorism, violations of human rights. If there are existing sanctions against those things, or if new sanctions against those things are required, then they will absolutely be put on. But what we won't do is reimpose nuclear sanctions while pretending they're for some other purpose. And that's what the president thinks that some of these bills are designed to do, and that's why he'll veto them. So I don't know that Secretary Clinton has directly addressed any of these bills, but I think you can, her position is that we uphold our side of the bargain, and we make sure that they uphold their
And we
side
can
of the
count on
bargain.
her veto.
She hasn't, as far as I know, specifically talked about particular bills, but she has said she strongly supports this deal. And I think that means every aspect of this deal, which means that that we do have every right to put on sanctions about those other activities, but we don't put in, the deal is specific on this point, that we don't put in new sanctions under the guise of doing some other sanction.
And part of what you mentioned that she was...
By the way, I should also, she supports a clean extension of the Iran Sanctions Act, which gives the United States the right to impose new sanctions, but allows the president to waive them. And by clean, that means we're going to carry on doing what we're doing now. It'll be out there as a potential tool, but if Iran is upholding its side of the bargain, then the president will continue to waive those sanctions.
And part of what you mentioned that she has been quite effective at is to precisely negotiate the sanctions that were imposed. These were unprecedented, had never managed to get other countries to buy into this as much as possible. But we seem to also see now that that has left some problems, in the sense that many companies, many banks have been absolutely terrified of doing business in Iran. It seems to have been part of the strategy to pursue rather fuzzy rules combined with astronomical fines, which led every bank to think that it's just much better not to involve yourself in anything that has the word Iran in it. And despite the deal, despite the fact that we're months after implementation, despite the fact that the IAEA has issued several reports saying that everything is actually being implemented, the banks still have a lot of that fear. So clearly we're in a situation that you cannot create that fear and then think you can just turn a switch and it will be off. And the administration, to their credit, have been working and gone and met with the banks, etc., in order to be able to give them the confidence that now they can engage in these activities without getting into trouble. Is that something we also can continue to count on the Clinton administration to do, precisely because of the fact that if the Iranians don't end up getting their sanctions relief, you're going to start to see some real problems on the Iranian side when it comes to their Donald Trumps, and they have plenty of those guys, that would start doing things that would be very, very damaging to the sustainability of the deal.
And again, we're going to have to see X number of months from now, but I would just repeat, the deal, nothing more and nothing less. So I think we're all conscious that, this needs to be seen to work in Iran in the way it was laid out, that there would be improvements to Iran's economy through sanctions relief if Iran did what it had to do. Iran, according to the IAEA, has done what it has to do, and those sanctions will be lifted. But I think, the Obama administration has really gone the extra mile to, it's an odd circumstance for the Secretary of State to be meeting with banks and briefing them and telling them it's safe that wasn't part of the deal, that we not only had to lift the sanctions, but we had to somehow become the PR firm of the Iranian financial system. So I don't think you can accuse the Obama administration of not working to make this work. And just as there are aspects of the deal that people here don't like and they would like to be revisited, well, maybe there are some aspects of the deal that people in Iran don't like and they wish they had negotiated that we did more somehow to persuade banks to do business with Iran. But in that sense, the United States, I think, has done what it is committed to do, which is lift those sanctions and make clear to banks what is and is not possible. But let's be honest, in the case of Iran, years of activities that have produced sanctions of lots of different layers for lots of different reasons for lots of different countries, banks are going to understandably be nervous. And there's also, the question of mismanagement within the Iranian financial system and economy itself, and it's going to take some time. There are a lot of countries that banks don't have a huge amount of confidence doing business in. So I think we do have an interest in Iranians believing that the deal is working as it's supposed to work, but Iran has some work to do in that regard, and you can only expect so much, I think, from the United States. It said it would lift the sanctions and make clear what is and isn't legal under the deal, and I think it's doing that, and you can expect it to continue to.
You mentioned during your remarks, that the situation in the region in some ways have either not changed or frankly have gotten worse. The critics would say that it's because of the deal, and I think that's a rather unfair criticism because at the end of the day, the trajectory was already negative and it would have been even worse if we didn't have this deal. And Iran has its responsibility for the things that it's done that are highly problematic and destabilizing. But it's not the only one that is engaged in activities in the region that are highly problematic. And I think one of the very interesting changes that we've seen in this city, which we can just see right now with what's going on in Congress with a bill that would try to find ways to punish Saudi Arabia for its role and its activities, it seems to be a rather dramatic shift in the mood of the country. Seems to be a dramatic shift in the way that we are no longer willing to turn a blind eye to the type of funding that the Saudis have been providing to jihadi movements. Based on documents that I'm sure Hillary Clinton did not want anyone to see through various websites that managed to find them, she seems to also have a view that is very strongly critical of the role of Saudi Arabia and has been quite clear, at least in private, about the damage that has come out of decades of funding Salafi schools and mosques, not just in the region, but elsewhere as well. What do you think will happen in the next 4 to 8 years? Are we going to have business as usual with Saudi Arabia, or are there going to be a more robust conversation, not just with the enemies of the United States, but also with its friends?
I mentioned that she does believe that concomitant with the nuclear deal, it is important for the United States to stand with its partners in the region, and that includes our Gulf Cooperation Council partners and Saudi Arabia. And to the degree that lifting sanctions in Iran can increase their insecurities and enable Iran to play a more active role in the region, then the United States is going to need to stand by its partners, and I think you see the United States doing that already under President Obama. At the same time, she has said, not just in some emails you may be referring to, but in public speeches, that she's concerned about funding of extremist groups that has gone on for too long, and it's a real problem, and it is contributing to the ideology that we see leading to these very dangerous movements, not just in the region, but around the world. So I think she's been very clear about that issue and underscored how strongly she feels about it.
One thing, and I think we should be giving the Secretary a tremendous amount of credit, is that in this era in which one candidate is really trying to use and fuel bigotry and xenophobia, she has clearly stood against that. She's spoken out against it. Her own team is as diverse as the current White House is, which is also a rather interesting change in the last 10 years here in Washington. One thing that our community, in addition to many of the things that are happening, have been hit by, which unfortunately happened during President Obama's term, but it was because a provision was added to a must-pass bill, is that we have now legislated that you actually can discriminate against people based on their national origin. HR 158 last year imposed new rules that made sure that if you are a European citizen, but you were born in Iran, or if you traveled back during 5 years, you are exempt. You are kicked out of the visa waiver program. And it wasn't because you had done something, it's because your parents were born or you were born in a particular country. Clearly the administration was against this, but because it was attached by the Republican-controlled Senate to a must-pass bill, it went through. But if we have a change, both in the Senate and we have a Democratic president next year, do you think this is something that she will make sure is repealed and that we don't go down the slippery slope of starting with small things like this, but it can end up into something much, much bigger in which suddenly it is legitimate to be able to discriminate based on national origin?
Well, first, thank you for noticing her position on democracy and the rights of all Americans and diversity among her team. I think that's something she's long been committed to. I think already when she was First Lady in the White House, she started the tradition of Ramadan celebrations, and at the State Department she promoted educational work on the role of Islam within the United States so people understood it, to try to demystify it and get rid of this notion, or to remind people that there are lots of Muslim Americans. It's not some foreign thing. It's part of our own country and part of our own democracy, and the people around her and her very strong stand, in contrast to the other candidate, about avoiding bigotry and discrimination. I mean, all of these things are the essence of what she stands for, and absolutely critical. So I appreciate your underscoring that. I think that's one of the things really at stake in this campaign, where, again, you've seen on the other side direct questioning of whether people are real Americans if they happen to originally come from somewhere else. As for particular legislation, look, I mean, you know the origin of that legislation, and the visa waiver program has been seen as a privilege, and it's certainly open travel is in the business interest of the United States and the diplomatic interest of the United States and the cultural industry of the United States, and Secretary Clinton absolutely believes in that. At the same time, after these terrorist attacks, there was great concern that people were traveling to countries with a lot of terrorism and potentially coming in on the visa waiver program. So she supported that effort that ended up in the legislation. Now, will it change, or are there changes that could be made? That remains to be seen. But I think the general principle of not allowing completely visa-free travel for anyone who might be going to countries that are either state sponsors of terrorism or with active large terrorist movements is, understandable in these circumstances.
And on that point, I don't think anyone in our community or elsewhere had any particular problem with that aspect, because that was initially supposed to be making sure that you cannot be a European citizen, go and fight with Nusra or ISIS or some of the other groups that other US allies actually support, but nevertheless, and then be able to travel back to the United States. But that's not what's happened. At this point, you have a scenario in which you are excluded based on where your parents were born and where you were born. You may never have set foot in that country. It's not something you did. It's your DNA. Combined with the fact that if you want to include countries that are at risk and travel, then it's again a very peculiar situation in which Iran is included as a potential ISIS risk, but Saudi Arabia is not. And these are the things that I don't think the politics of this will be wrong. The Democrats did not want to see this happen, but it happened. And now it's the law. The question is if there's enough political will to undo it. Because, again, if it was just the travel, it would be a different thing. But it's actually based on where you were born. or where your parents were born, which is a highly problematic principle. If we extend that, then we're going to end up in a scenario that I don't think in any way, shape, or form are compatible with American values. You agree? Excellent. That was the answer we wanted. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We have a couple of minutes for a Q&A, and I know I've not been a good example because I ask long questions, but I'm going to ask you guys to ask short and to-the-point questions. Francis first.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Gordon. I apologize to beat I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but this issue of Saudi Arabia. At a recent retreat organized by McCain Institute, I was having a conversation with a senior minister from Singapore in which he said that literally every terrorist in Asia has come from Saudi-funded Wahhabist madrasa that turned into a terrorist. This is a senior minister, a friend of ours from government of Singapore, as an example. So since 9/11, we have systematically ignored the role of Saudi funding of this Wahhabist madrasa around the world. Every terrorist in this country, from Riverside to Florida to New York to Brussels, has been a Wahhabist-inspired terrorist. Every one of them, and yet we don't seem to want to pay attention to it. So I guess the question again is, I apologize, I don't mean to emphasize this, but at some point, we need to go to real source of the so-called global terrorism. How are we going to do it?
I don't know. I can only reiterate what we said before, that Secretary Clinton herself has drawn attention to this issue and been very clear about the costs and consequences to the United States and the world of the types of funding that you referred to. I know a lot of experts on the subject would concur with that. There is a lot of change going on in Saudi Arabia right now, and given the public position that she has taken on the issue, I talked about her, consolidating relationships with partners in the region. I think you can be absolutely certain that on the agenda of those partnerships is going to be that issue, because it is something that hits home here. And if the terrorism we face around the world has a linkage to this funding, then the funding needs to stop. And so part of the relationship that we'll have with Saudi Arabia going forward is going to have to address that issue.
Ozzy? Wait for the mic. Wait for the mic.
Hi, thank you. You did a piece with Jeffrey Goldberg this year in The Atlantic, where he interviewed you about
right.
the Syria conflict. And you seem to be very critical of Obama's Syria position, and specifically the red line position that a lot of other people have been critical about. Since that seems to be, you've talked about Syria a lot and how it's a conflict that needs to be mitigated and resolved. Don't you see Iran being a key player at the table to resolve that conflict? And in that same respect, don't you see them kind of as the missing piece, especially now that Russia is involved as well? Can't you see Iran playing a big role in mitigating the conflict there?
Yes, and I've said that as well. I think Iran is a key variable and has a key role to play and should be part of the conversation. For a long time, it wasn't even in any way at the table, and then ultimately, as part of this International Syria Support Group, it became conversation. Even when, or even especially when we have real differences, then those need to be addressed. I have paid a lot of attention to Syria because I think it is the consequence of that war are just horrific. Obviously, first and foremost, in a humanitarian sense, with hundreds of thousands of killed and millions displaced, and once again, as we speak, such horrific things taking place. But it's also destabilizing neighbors, with 3 million refugees in Turkey and 2 million in Jordan and 1 million in Lebanon, which is a quarter of the population. and Iraq and Europe, with more than 1 million, provoking far-right movements, even affecting our politics at home. In part, the consequences of the Syrian war, you see the repercussions here in terms of fears of refugees and immigrants and Muslims and some of the things that are coming up. So it is absolutely essential for all of us to bring the conflict to an end. And Iran does have a role to play, because Iran is, I talked about two-way streets. Iran is currently just giving all the backing it can to the Assad regime, which is also backed by the Russians, showing no interest in any sort of compromise. And one of the things I have written and said about Syria is that we should make a priority of de-escalating the conflict, because at this point almost any peace in Syria would be better than the current war. And for even that to happen, we need the Assad regime and Russia and Iran to accept that there's some alternative to them just militarily taking over the whole country. So, and for that to happen, I think Russia and Iran bear a great responsibility. So far, they're not showing that, and I fear that if they continue down the current path, we're just going to see more war and more sectarianism and more fear of Iran, and that will create Sunni backlashes among the Gulf countries, which will just perpetuate the sectarianism, which is not only destroying Syria, but spreading to Yemen, Iraq, and elsewhere. So everyone has a role to play here, and part of that role does need to be even the Saudis and the Iranians as part of a broader solution to this problem.
See, I have a hard time seeing because, yes, over there. Yes.
I remember Secretary Clinton made a speech shortly after the deal in which she said, basically, this is not the beginning of an opening, right?
Sorry, shortly after what? I'm sorry.
After the deal.
Yeah.
She had a speech where she said, this is not the beginning of an opening, this is basically it, right? So, I mean, and those words are heard back in Iran too. So, with that position, how does she expect to get cooperation on the other issues? Or should we interpret that as a public posture that in reality she has a different approach?
Right. So, I mean, first and foremost, you should interpret it as clarity that the deal was worth doing as the deal. It was not premised on developing glorious cooperation across the board. It didn't assume that. It was because Iran was moving towards a nuclear weapons capability, and we had to stop that, and that was the deal. As for the rest, I think she is clear-eyed and skeptical, appropriately so, and not wanting to imply that this means that we don't have real differences and can just start overlooking some of the differences that we have. And that's why, again, I come back to the two-way street. Those in this country and elsewhere who have wanted to see more cooperation with Iran, to have it spread from the nuclear to elsewhere, need something to work with. And so long as they don't have much to work with, if Iran is accelerating long-range ballistic missile tests and not working to de-escalate the conflict in Syria and backing Assad as he bombs hospitals, then it's going to be hard for Secretary Clinton or anyone to make the case that we should be doing more diplomacy and working out. So I do think that this is one where we all agree that long-term there should be a better relationship, and she's been clear that this is not against the Iranian people, and the Iranian people deserve a better future. But for diplomacy to be possible, we need to see some sign that the Iranians are willing to be more cooperative on some of these regional issues. I think that's Secretary Clinton's view, and it's the current administration's view as well.
We have run out of time, but I do want to ask you one last question, and I know it's an unfair question. But in case we actually have a President Trump, we talked about this during the previous panel, and one of the panelists said, even if President Trump loses, the legacy of the fire that he started by using this bigotry, etc., is still going to be there, and it's going to be a massive problem. What will the Democratic Party, what will Secretary Clinton do to make sure that even though she may not be president, that this wave of bigotry, xenophobia is pushed back?
Well, Trita, the thing to do is make sure that she is the next president and that we avoid, I mean, I can think of a lot of reasons. Thank you. I know, in diplomacy we do a lot of, fallback scenario, plan B, what if this. I don't really want to sit here and contemplate the world in which Mr. Trump becomes president and these issues come to the fore with the diplomatic consequences that you can imagine and the consequences for harmony in this country. I mean, this is a no-joke moment. We are less than 2 months away for an election in which, it's going to be one or the other. And, I can obviously tell from the questions in the room, people don't agree with Secretary Clinton on everything. That's fine. And there's some diplomatic issues we may have differences on, but it seems to me not a close call. It seems to me not a close call on any aspect of it, but on this thing that you just raised there, the question of bringing Americans together and underscoring that we're all Americans, Muslim Americans, Hispanic Americans, African Americans. There the choice couldn't be clearer. And so I hate to think that there are people out there not motivated to vote because maybe they have a different view on Saudi Arabia than her or something like that, and just kind of let it pass. And then we wake up in this world where we've got other things on our plate in terms of divisiveness within this country. So I think I'm kind of glad you said it was a hard question. It was actually, I welcome that question because it really allows us to end with that point. You have a candidate in Secretary Clinton who will do all she can to bring this country together, including making sure people understand that Muslim Americans and Iranian Americans are Americans too, and they have an important voice to be heard.
Thank you so much on that note. And let me also clarify, we worked really, really hard to get someone from the Trump campaign to come and do exactly what Phil and what the Clinton campaign has done, to come here and talk to us, answer our questions, engage with our community. For very surprising reasons, we never heard back. So I want to say that we truly appreciate you coming here, engaging with us on these questions. I think there is far more agreement than there is disagreement, but it is the nature of a situation like this that we have to focus on things that we could perhaps get further movement on. Thank you so much.
We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.